Hi. In my last video, I compared the British Army with the French Army. That video ruffled a few feathers, so I thought I would press my luck by dragging Italy into the chat. Italy, I find really very interesting. It has a very large military. It's a very capable military, and strangely enough, it's a military that's completely ignored and overlooked by almost everybody else. Certainly by Americans. I've never heard Americans ever talk about the Italian military. When I was at the Rand Corporation, I was there for 11 years. Whenever people talked about European militaries and European military capabilities, the Italians never ever came up. For example, almost 10 years ago at RAND, they did a war game in which they looked into how large of a force would be required to defend the Baltics from a Russian invasion. And they came up with an answer that was something like some number of American heavy brigades plus one heavy brigade each from Britain, France, and Germany. This made perfect sense at the time when one thinks large European militaries, Western European militaries, one thinks Germany, Britain, France. But it's only afterwards that I thought, well, wait a minute, what about the Italians? The Italians also could have produced a heavy brigade, so why not them? Now, one answer could be that maybe the RAND experts who did that study looked at the Italian military and just decided it wasn't a candidate for this kind of thing. But I don't actually think that's true. Why? Because afterwards they asked me to do a study to find out whether or not it was even possible for the British, French, and Germans to come up with and sustain a heavy brigade, meaning they hadn't actually picked Britain, France, or Germany based on their capabilities or any knowledge of the capabilities. It was just a presumption. Likewise, for whatever reason, they never thought about the Italians. I think that's what really was going on. I think that's a pity because I think that the Italian military, as I said, is very large, it's very capable, and it's certainly very interesting. It has some really interesting capabilities. By the way, it also happens to be larger than the British military, and it does it all at about half the budget, half the expense of the British military, which I think in and of itself is super interesting. So in this video, I'm going to look at the Italian military. I'm going to look at its capabilities, and I'm going to talk about, well, how is it that the Italians managed to achieve such great bang for the buck? Like, what's the catch? Is there a catch? Yeah, there's kind of a catch. But also, like, what are they doing right? Notwithstanding the catch. So that's what I'm going to do. My name is Michael Shirkin. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Pax Americana, a conversation about world affairs, global conflict, military strategy, and anything else that happens to be in my mind. Let's get some facts out of the way. First of all, Italy spends well below 2%. I think it's about 1.6% of GDP on defense. This translates into a defense budget that's about half that of the United Kingdom. Precise numbers are hard to come by, but what I found after some very vigorous Googling was that the Italian defense budget was about $33.5 billion in 2022. And for the United Kingdom, it was about $70 billion in 2024. So not quite apples to apples. But the British military has currently roughly 166,000 people on active duty, while the UK has 138,000 people on active duty. The Italian army has 98,000 people on active duty, while Britain's army weighs in at 73,000, again on active duty. If we compare, though, let's look a little bit more closely. If we compare the British military with the Italian military, we see that they're kind of roughly the same, right? I mean, you have to get really into the details, into the weeds to see that they have this, they have that, this is better than that kind of thing. But more or less, this sort of works out the same, other than the basic fact that the Italians simply have more people. Just a few examples. Italy has about the same number or more even of fighter jets in its inventory. It's on track to have more F-35s than Britain will, including a mix of F-35s and 35As and F-35Bs, in addition to some Euro fighters. This does give Britain only have F-35Bs, which at the very least is good news for the Royal Navy. If you look at the navies, they have about the same amount of warships, although from what I understand, the Italian frigates in general on average are better than the British frigates in the sense that they are all modern, state-of-the-art FREM, whereas the British fleet is a little bit more mixed. The UK has 2 carriers, brand new carriers. Italy has 1, 2, or 3 carriers, depending on how you define carrier, and the difference between a carrier and an amphibious assault ship or a landing craft helicopter, what are those called? The LHD. The third carrier, the smallest of them all, the oldest, the Garibaldi, is due to be phased out of service. So that's going to leave the Cavour and the Trieste. Both of them are going to be able to can handle F-35s. I think the plan is that the Cavour will almost always have F-35s, whereas the Trieste will sort of as needed. Um, they have F-35s also, and they still have AV-8B Harriers, which eventually will be phased out as the F-35s come online. The UK and Italy have roughly the same number of attack submarines, I think like 8 versus 9 or something like that. Of course, the Royal Navy's attack submarines are nuclear submarines, which makes them a lot more capable than the Italian Navy's diesel submarines, but also makes them a lot more expensive. Let's take a moment just to sort of dwell on the Cavour, the carrier, and just sort of savor it. It's a beautiful ship. At the moment, I believe the Cavour is actually in the Pacific, showing the flag, the Italian flag in the Indo-Pacific. Reportedly, it is present in carrying 8 F-35Bs on board, and it can carry up to 15 F-35Bs. In comparison, the much bigger HMS Queen Elizabeth can carry up to 48, and is expected to carry usually a normal load of 12 to 24 F-35s. The Queen Elizabeth, of course, is a much bigger ship. It's got twice the displacement of the Cavour. It's 40 meters longer. Still, I think it's fair to say that the Cavour packs a serious punch. The Cavour's very existence, by the way, I think raises some really interesting questions about the Queen Elizabeth. So the Cavour exists. It's got power. It's got F-35s. It's going to be a lot cheaper. Is it good enough? Do you really need to have a Queen Elizabeth? The cost of the Queen Elizabeth class, based on, again, my vigorous Googling, works out to about at least £8 billion for the two ships together. I can't find any data about how much the Cavour costs, but obviously it costs a lot less. It's a much smaller ship. Obviously, the Queen Elizabeth class is more capable. Yeah, all things being even, you'd rather have a Queen Elizabeth than a Cavour. But when you look at the cost, you have to wonder, how do they compare in terms of value? Unfortunately, it's almost impossible to do this, because you would need some sort of metric. Like, what's the metric? Some sort of like a unit of fighting capability of an aircraft carrier. And then you'd have to understand, well, what is the unit price of that? And then when you look at that, is the Cavour a much better value than the Queen Elizabeth? I don't actually know. I'm going to guess that it is, but how, I don't know how to calculate. But I think I'd love to be able to ask this question. It also begs the question of, what is a carrier even for, right? And if you can't answer that question clearly, then it's hard to figure out whether or not 8 F-35s is good enough. Maybe you really need 12 or 24. Maybe that's what you do. Maybe it's one of those things like go big go home, or if you're going to bother having carrier, you need to spend all the money to have a really big carrier for all sorts of reasons. I'd like to think that the Royal Navy did all this research, that, the Royal Navy and RUSI and all these other defense institutions really did their homework. They did their war games and simulations to try to understand, first of all, what is the purpose of a carrier? How big of a carrier do you really need? And then they came to the conclusions that they came, and they ended up with the Queen Elizabeth class. But still, you look at the Cavour and you got to scratch your head and wonder, gosh, maybe that's good enough. Remember, it was ships like the Cavour that Britain used to defeat the Argentines in the Falklands War. Those were really very small aircraft carriers, nothing like the Queen Elizabeth class today, and certainly nothing like the carriers that, American carriers. If we turn to the armies and compare the Italian and the British armies, again, the Italian army is bigger. But when you look at the weeds, when you look at it in general, roughly speaking, they're kind of equivalent, maybe sort of. I mean, you'd really have to get into details, like how many brigades, how many regiments, what's the force structure of each regiment, how many people are in them, how do they organize them? You really have to get into it. I don't think that's necessary here to get into that kind of detail. I think it's fair to say that they're roughly the same. The one thing that the Italian army clearly has that the British does not is the Italian army has 2 Alpine brigades, which are reputed to be excellent. So these are sort of elite units within the Italian army. Again, very, very high reputation. The other thing of interest is that the Italians, like the French, have, and in contrast to the British, have a fleet of relatively new and modern armored vehicles that are all pretty much current or date from the last 20 years or like at their oldest from the 1990s. And these vehicles have all the latest technologies, the same kinds of technologies that I talked about in the video that I did on the British Army, the French Army, the collaborative warfare stuff, Salute, etc. So it's all very up to date, and it's all exactly the kind of stuff that the British Army has been trying without much success to develop really over the past 20, 30 years, with the Ajax only finally now coming into service. So what are we talking about here? Just three examples. We've got the Centauro 2. Here's an image of that. It's I think it's pretty neat. It's like, it's like an infantry fighting vehicle, except it's got this big gun on it. It's curious in that, for one thing, it's often described as a tank destroyer. Also, the Italians seem to have conceived of this to meet certain requirements. And yet they're the only ones in Western Europe, as far as I know, that have this thing. Does that mean that they're the only ones with those requirements, or the only ones who came up with the solution to meet those requirements? I don't really know. Either way, it's modern, it's capable. I'd love to know how useful this thing might be in Ukraine. Maybe very, maybe not at all. I don't know. There's also the Freccia, which is a very modern infantry fighting vehicle. And then that joins the Dardo, the older Dardo, which I believe dates from the 1990s, which is an infantry fighting vehicle, but it's tracked. Italy also has 200 Ariete main battle tanks. They're good. I think they're roughly as good as all the other Western main battle tanks, although from what I've read, they're badly in need of a refresh. They don't have the latest tech, the stuff that makes the more recent iterations of the Leclerc and the Leopard and, soon to be the Challenger 3 better, right? Italy has frequently deferred modernizing the Ariete fleet. They have apparently recently chosen to go ahead and modernize 120 of them, while also buying 125 Leopard 2A8 tanks. And then both of them are going to be in their fleet. Now, if all goes according to plan, if they actually do this, this means that Italy will have, finally, after they've modernized the Arietas, they will have over 200 up-to-date tanks, whereas Britain, with its current plans to modernize something like 140, 149 of the Challenger 2s to the Challenger 3 spec, will have a much smaller fleet. All right, all of this is really very impressive. But what's the catch? There's always a catch. So what is it? According to Matteo de Celso, I have no idea how to pronounce Italian, unfortunately. It's a shame. It's a beautiful language. He's argued in a very excellent article that he published on the Italian military, that he published in War on the Rocks in February of 2024. He wrote that the Italians have consistently underinvested in operational costs and maintenance, sustainment, like everything it takes to actually keep the army running, and that they spend too much money, relatively speaking, on personnel. The just being that maybe the military is just too big. They've got too many people. And it'd be better if it would be smaller so that they could spend more of the money on the spare parts and the sustainment and the training and all that kind of thing. I find this interesting because he published in February 2024. It confirms, or rather, it's in line with what I learned when I did research for an article that I wrote on the Italian military for Wavell Room in 2021. So in other words, the stuff that I heard and read in 2021 apparently is still true, or at least was true as of the time when that War on the Rocks article was written. And what I heard at the time in 2021 was that the Italian army was in danger of having hollow units, because so much of their kit was in disrepair, couldn't be maintained, they didn't have spare parts, and also there's a question of training, whether or not enough people were getting enough of the kind of training that they needed. Apparently the Italian army, at least as late as 2021, was still suffering from the legacy of the Afghanistan war. And what happened during the Afghanistan war was that the Italians, in order to ensure that the troops deployed to Afghanistan were well-trained, well-equipped, everything was good to go, that they basically stripped away parts, funding, training hours from everybody else. So the guys who went to Afghanistan were in tip-top shape. Everybody else, not so much. I'd like to think that now, all these years later, that now maybe finally the Italian army has caught up. But I don't know. Remains to be seen. And of course, another option for the Italian army is just the Italian military is to raise their defense budget to get it above 1.6%. I mean, if they got 2%, that would really be something. So let's focus, though, on some differences between the Italians and the British and also the French to try to understand how it is that Italy notwithstanding what I just said about the underinvestment in maintenance and sustainment, how it is that Italy still manages to have such a large and potent force uh, on a tight budget, right? What's the secret? So first of all, obviously, Italy does not have nuclear weapons, and the cost of nuclear deterrence, maintaining the nuclear deterrence, soaks up a very large portion of the British defense budgets. So, yay, Italy. Another reason is that Italy, like France, has done a very good job over the decades of nurturing its own defense industry. So the Italian defense industry is quite capable of meeting Italy's requirements and delivering the goods. And although this might be counterintuitive, that seems to translate into greater economies. I think the same thing can be said about the French. Americans, by the way, y'all should know that the U.S. Navy, which seems to be having a very difficult time designing and building ships, has actually turned to the Italians for its new frigates. The new USS Constellation class is a variant of the Italian frigate built by Fincantieri, which I think, that says something about the abilities of the Italian defense firm. It also, unfortunately, says something about the abilities of American shipbuilders, which I think should have us all very concerned. That's perhaps a topic for another video. Now, the third reason why the Italians, or our explanation for how the Italians managed to get so much bang for their buck, I think is really the most important of them all, which is that notwithstanding the current visit of the Cavour battle group to the Indo-Pacific, the Italians very clearly have much more modest ambitions than the British or the French. In lieu of global ambitions, the Italians have very clearly chosen to focus on the sort of NATO's southern flank and the greater Mediterranean area, which they understand to go from the Arabian Sea to the Gulf of Guinea. This might explain, for example, why Italy is content with diesel submarines when nuclear submarines are better, but nuclear submarines are really a requirement for countries that have global ambitions. If you're just operating in the Mediterranean, perhaps a diesel submarine will do. But this tighter vision, this more modest ambition simply lends clarity with respect to the kind of force structure you need, the kind of capabilities you need, the kinds of equipment you need. Maybe this explains why the Freccia has wheels, why the Centauro has wheels. But clearly the Italians ultimately are thinking about the Mediterranean, thinking about North Africa, the Middle East, the Sahel maybe, West Africa. It's a very different kind of problem set than if you're thinking about trying to be able to do everything anywhere in the world, the way the British kind of still flirt with and the French still flirt with. This means that, and this is sort of the catch, right? The other side of the coin is that, like France, Italy does not have the kind of force that it might have had if its focus had been on Russia, right? Or conventional warfare against the Russians. Italy has all the same capability gaps that the French do, and also the British. I'm talking about the capabilities that, because of the Ukraine war, we all understand are now really essential for the modern battlefield with conventional warfare. We're talking about drones, counter-drones, ISR, counter-ISR, air defenses, electronic warfare, long-range fires, artillery. I mean, they have the stuff, but just not at this kind of scale that we now know because of the Ukraine war. It needs to be bigger. They need to have more. They have about 90 German PZH-2000 howitzers, really marvelous piece of kit. And the numbers are on par with what the French and the British have in terms of their stuff that's comparable. Not quite enough. They have 21 MLRS, multiple launch rocket systems, which is actually less than the British Army, but a lot more than the French Army. Reportedly, the Italians have just ordered 21 more. They're also scrambling to upgrade their defense capabilities. I think even just this week I read that the Italians ordered 10 more SAMPT-NG air defense systems. Those are a European equivalent to the Patriot, U.S. Patriot air defense system. They're trying to catch up, and all this is all well and good. And I'm sure the Italians are going to manage to fill some of the gaps and improve some of the weak capabilities. But of course, any time that the Italians or anybody has to lay out money to fill capability gaps, it means that you're not spending money on other things that maybe you should be spending the money on, or that you also have to be spending the money on. So it just becomes a problem to do that while trying to do all the other things that you're trying to do. With all this said and done, why do I think so highly of the Italians, given the above concerns? What I like about the Italians, besides the fact that I think, they have an interesting military with some interesting capabilities, they have really interesting equipment. They have just different approaches to things, and I find that all very interesting. But what the real success here, and what I respect in the Italians, and what I find just really impressive, is that they have tailored their force in alignment with their ambitions and their policy objectives, which is what we should all be doing, but very often is not the case. And for countries with limited means, this is really the secret. This is what it's all about: having a force that's tailored, that's aligned with your actual policy and your objectives. It's harder to do than it might appear, and I think that the Italians have actually pulled that off. I think that's really remarkable. This is also why I find the smaller militaries more interesting than the United States military. The United States military has a budget of nearly $1 trillion, and when you've got like $1 trillion budget, the whole issue of what kind of choices you have to make and what do you need to invest in, it becomes this whole other different thing, because ultimately you kind of aspire to do everything. You can almost do everything. When you're dealing with the Italians or the British or the French or just a lot of other countries, that's not really the case. They have to be picky. They have to make decisions, and they have to make informed decisions. Now, do they always make the right decisions? That's debatable. Has Italy made the right decisions? Also debatable. But the process of making decisions is what I think makes them really interesting, and why I think that everybody, in particular Americans who don't have to think that hard, maybe we don't think, well, we don't have to think that hard, why I think that we need to be paying attention to the smaller militaries like the Italians. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. Please check out, I put links to all the different articles in that I've mentioned in the description. Please also check out LinkedIn, Twitter. There's also my Substack, paxamerica.com. There's also a link in the description, and my website, michaelshirkin.com. And I look forward to seeing you in my next video. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.